What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Germans in North Africa? Most likely Nazi troops marching around in a 1940s era Morocco? Well, long before Humphrey Bogart was helping refugees escape Casablanca, tens of thousands of Germanic troops had amassed upon the shores of the Maghreb and elsewhere around the Mediterranean, creating unique, albeit short-lived kingdoms in one of the more turbulent areas of the contemporary world. These ancient people were known as the Goths, far removed from the edgy subculture that has cropped up in America and Britain since the 1980s, and at one point in time, the Goths, who were not necessarily a unified group, were the main driving force behind the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and were best known by the name barbarian, which obviously has certain connotations in the modern English-speaking world. The emergence of the Goths and other Germanic tribes streaming from the far north was a premonition of the collapse of the world's most powerful empire in all of history, and the coming dark age in Europe that would plunge the continent into the backwards and deprived state of medieval times. The Germanic peoples began as a small collection of tribes in the far north of Europe, in an area that was virtually uninhabitable 11,000 years ago due to the last ice age, and it was a few centuries before the beginning of the first millennium that these Germanic tribes began to migrate south from Scandinavia and into the area that would become modern Germany, known to the ancient Romans as Germania, hence where Germanic peoples and the nation of Germany get their name from. These Germanic peoples inhabiting modern Netherlands and Germany were a major pest to the Roman Empire, launching frequent raids into Roman territory. Although the Romans were able to stave off most major Germanic invasions from the north, in the 4th century AD, the quickly rising Huns from the east, coupled with a coalition of Germanic and Slavic tribes, all of whom were collectively referred to as barbarians by the Romans at that time, hammered the already politically unstable and divided Roman Empire, with Rome being sacked no less than 4 times in only 150 years. Although historians are unsure of the ethno-linguistic origin of the Huns, as they kept no written records, they were most likely an Altaic group originating from the steppes of northern or central Asia, and there was a historical conflation between the Germanic invaders and their Hunnic counterparts, who were by no means allies, although it was common for Huns to use Germanic troops in their ranks, and this is the reason for the Allied propaganda portraying the Germans as the Hun menace during the First and Second World Wars. The Alans, an ancient Iranian people in the North Caucasian region, also pushed into Eastern Europe, where they later moved into the Roman Empire, becoming a part of the loosely affiliated barbarian coalition relentlessly pummeling Rome. This was the beginning of what is known as the migration period of Europe, where various groups in and around Europe spread out far beyond the confines of their original borders, and was the beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire, with irreversible territorial atrophy to the Germanic peoples, who by this time were known as the Goths. The Goths most likely originated in the region of Götaland in southern Sweden, and migrated into what is modern Poland, which at the time was Slavic territory, traveling south until reaching the Black Sea. The Goths established a small colony on the southern tip of the Crimean Peninsula alongside other Greek and Slavic communities, and raided the Eastern Roman Empire in both Anatolia and the Balkans before traveling west. This Gothic group was then split into the Ostrogoths, or Eastern Goths, and Visigoths, or Western Goths, who both spoke dialects of the Gothic language, and along with a multitude of other Germanic peoples, utterly dominated Europe in the power vacuum left by the Western Roman Empire, although their reign was fairly ephemeral. Now, the Vandals, who were alluded to at the beginning of the video, didn't follow the same path of migration that the Goths took, and although the Vandals were a fellow closely related Eastern Germanic people group, they were not a part of the same Gothic subgroup of the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, and Crimean Goths, among others. The Vandals, along with the Caucasian Alans, migrated to Iberia, founding their own kingdoms in the southern half of the peninsula, and the predominant language during this time in Iberia was still Latin, although the ruling class of the Alan and Vandal kingdoms spoke Alan and Vandalic respectively. Meanwhile, the Ostrogoths had migrated from Dacia into the crumbling Western Roman Empire, and the ascension of the Germanic king Odoacer of Pannonia to the throne of Rome is considered to be the official end of the Western Roman Empire. Odoacer's kingdom would evolve into the Ostrogoth kingdom, consisting of the former Roman provinces of Italia, Pannonia, and Dalmatia, and similar to the Vandal kingdom in Iberia, the lingua franca remained Latin, while Gothic was spoken by the elite minority. The Visigoth kingdom was also established during the same time period, consisting of most of Iberia and parts of southern France bordering the Ostrogoths, and both Germanic kingdoms claimed to be the rightful successors of the Roman Empire. Perhaps most fascinatingly, upon the encroachment of the Western Goths into southern Iberia, the other foreign powers located there, the Alans and Vandals, were forced to flee to North Africa, specifically the Maghreb region, consisting of modern northern Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. A force of nearly 100,000 Alans and Vandals were able to conquer the provinces of Africa, Mauritania, and Numidia from the Romans, establishing the Vandal kingdom, a combination of Germanic and Iranian influences respectively, in the continent of Africa no less, which is certainly something I can get behind. The mass migration and takeover by the Goths and other Germanic groups was considered disastrous by the Eastern Romans, who were increasingly encroached upon on all sides by Persians, Goths, and others, and a massive campaign was launched by Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, also known as Justinian the Great, who in the mid-6th century managed to reconquer the territory held by the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Alans and Vandals in North Africa, and parts of the Visigoth kingdom in Iberia. Because of the relatively perfunctory nature of the Ostrogoth and Vandal kingdoms, there was no major linguistic, cultural, or genetic shift in these territories, and once returned to the hands of the Eastern Romans, Latin quickly returned as the administrative language. The remainder of Goths, Vandals, and other Germanic peoples were assimilated into the Italic population of Italy, while in North Africa their culture would be entirely wiped out following the Islamic Arab invasion of the Maghreb. As for the Alans, although they no longer exist as a group in Iberia, North Africa, or elsewhere in Europe, the Ossetians of the Caucasus in modern Russia and Georgia are descended from the last of the Alans that remained in the Caucasian region. The Visigoths of Iberia actually survived considerably longer than the Ostrogoths or Vandals, and it wasn't until the Islamic invasion of Iberia that their kingdom fell, and most Goths were assimilated into the Islamic Moorish population, although a small contingent of Goths and Vandals managed to escape north into the kingdom of Asturias, and indeed the first Asturian king, Pelagius, was a Visigoth who started the Reconquista, or the reclaiming of the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors. It's unknown how long the Goths remained as a recognizable group in Iberia, although it's possible that the Gothic language survived in the West up until the 10th century AD, and the descendants of Goths are credited with leading the opposition against the Moors in Spain. There is one other Gothic group that we previously glossed over that did manage to survive much longer, a rather small and seemingly insignificant nation that managed to stay under the radar during this chaos. The Goths of Crimea actually managed to sustain centuries of rule under the Byzantines, Tartars, and other Turkic groups, with Crimea having a very fascinating makeup of Germanic Goths, Greeks, and Tartars, among others. The Crimean Gothic language is well documented and even had its own unique alphabet, being derivative of Greek, Latin, and other Germanic scripts, and during this time the Goths became one of the only Germanic groups to practice Orthodox Christianity in history while under the Byzantine Empire, yet still managed to maintain a distinct identity until the end of the 18th century, which was when the last of the Goths were assimilated into the Crimean Greek population or converted to Islam and were assimilated into the Crimean Tartar population. Ethnic Germans arrived very soon after in the Crimean Peninsula as a part of the state-sponsored German settlement of Eastern Europe, and some of these Germans claimed descent from the Crimean Goths, although this is considered possible but incredibly unlikely. Even though the Goths are no longer a distinct ethnic group or nation, it is fascinating to think about the huge role they played in the fall of the Roman Empire and other major historical events such as the Reconquista, or just how many people in modern Europe have Gothic ancestors, which probably consists of a large number of Crimean Tartars, Pontic Greeks, smaller numbers of Italians, and possibly even a good-sized chunk of Spain and Portugal today, and by extension many in Latin America and the United States, with common Spanish surnames of Germanic origin including Fernandez, Gonzalez, Rodriguez, or even Gomez. And unsurprisingly, these particular names are especially common in the region of Asturias today. Now, contrary to popular belief, the so-called Gothic architecture of Western Europe doesn't have its origins in the 5th to 8th century Gothic kingdoms, but rather in medieval France during the 12th century, and the term Gothic was used to describe this style in a rather negative manner, likening the domineering and foreboding fashion to the uncivilized Germanic tribes of old, and it wasn't until later in history that the name stuck. Indeed, the names Vandal, Barbarian, and Goth all have innately negative or at least dark connotations in the English language, which is most likely a reflection of the dismal and hopeless period of time that the Romans were engaged in, whilst their empire that took over 1,000 years to forge was finally crashing down around them. Had the Goths, Vandals, and other Germanic peoples united in that era, it's entirely possible that Europe would look far different than it currently does, and the Germans wouldn't be the only dominant Germanic power in continental Europe. Be sure to let me know your thoughts on the Goths and their curt, albeit impactful, role in world history. And as always, this has been Mason. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.